Has the president or anyone at the White House ever asked or suggested that you open an investigation of anyone? Yes or no, please, sir?
The president or anybody else?
Seems you would remember something like that and be able to tell us.
Yeah, but I'm trying to grapple with the word suggest. I mean, there have been discussions of matters out there that they have not asked me to open an investigation, but
Perhaps they've suggested,
I don't know. I wouldn't say suggest.
hinted,
I don't know.
inferred. You don't know. Okay.
Senator Kamala Harris, a year ago on Capitol Hill, practically leaving the U.S. Attorney General speechless, reminding us of the alarmingly cozy relationship the president has with his AG. Former FBI Director Jim Comey addressing that in a statement just released after news of the DOJ seeking to drop Mike Flynn's case. Quote, "The DOJ has lost its way, but career people, please stay because America needs you. The country is hungry for honest, competent leadership." Joining us now, California Senator Kamala Harris, former Democratic presidential candidate, also the former Attorney General of California, a former district attorney. First, Senator Harris, on the news that Bill Barr has done what Donald Trump sought to get Jim Comey to do years ago, see to it to let Mike Flynn go.
It's not surprising, frankly, Nicole. That hearing, in May of last year, so a full year ago, I called for Bill Barr to resign. He clearly has never followed the role, the responsibility, and the mission of the Attorney General, which is to be the people's lawyer. He has instead consistently done Donald Trump's bidding. And this is yet another example. And, here's the thing. Remember Elliot Richardson, Nixon's Attorney General, under a Republican, nominated by a Republican president, who refused to do the investigation of Archibald Cox and said, "I'm resigning." Right? The role and responsibility of the United States Department of Justice is to do justice, unimpeded, uninterfered by favor or fear, and also to do the work that is about doing justice and not being interfered with by a political agenda, which is clearly Donald Trump's agenda. It's outrageous, and I couldn't agree more. I absolutely agree. We have to make sure that the career professionals in that department stay there and hold down the fort in spite of the fact that there is an Attorney General of the United States who has really done the work of disrupting justice in America.
Well, I mean, it's work that's ongoing. Attorney General Barr is running a U.S. attorney out of Connecticut, Mr. Durham, who is re-examining, and it's become a criminal investigation as well, some of the very same conduct that's been examined almost half a dozen times by inspectors general and others. I mean, is there any way to reach in and protect the kind of individuals you're talking about, career prosecutors?
Well, one, we have to have oversight, and we've been asking for that oversight. I've asked that Barr comes before the Judicial Committee. I am on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we need to have oversight. We need to find out what is going on from the earliest days, and you played the tape of my questions of Barr when he was up for confirmation. Mm-hmm. We need to oversee what is happening in that agency in terms of what conversations Bill Barr is having with the president, what kind of conversations they are having that are about interfering with the justice that is being done by the career folks there. But this is outrageous. This is outrageous. And in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of people standing in line for hours to get food, in the midst of I just saw some information today, 1 out of 5 mothers are saying that their children are hungry. Yeah. In the midst of a crisis because this president will not use the Defense Production Act to get the number of tests out to America that we need to actually have some control over this pandemic. In the midst of all of that, the president has his attorney general, the hand of the president, doing his political work, his personal bidding in the face of what should be a Justice Department doing the work of preserving justice and fighting for justice in America. But that's not what we're going to get in Bill Barr. And frankly, again, I will say he should resign.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.